Okay, so remember I said last time that the harm principle is, I think, a good reason to put restrictions on people's behavior. So I want to talk about the harm principle in a lot more depth in this lecture. I also want to talk about, the harm principle I think can mean two things, and I want to talk about both of those. I think Mill means it in a stronger sense than I used it in the last lecture when he talks about the harm principle. I want to talk about what Mill means by it, and I want to talk about whether Mill and others who, embrace this stronger meaning of the harm principle have a good argument for it, and if they do, what that argument might look like. Okay, so let's talk about the two meanings of the harm principle. The harm principle, I think, can actually mean two different things. Now, in the last lecture, we talked about the harm principle as a positive principle. The fact that some behavior harms others is a good reason to restrict it or to flat out ban it. That's not controversial. Practically nobody disagrees with the claim that if some behavior harms others, that's a good reason to put restrictions on it. But we can also mean the harm principle as a negative principle. And as a negative principle, the harm principle says that harming others is the only good reason to ban or restrict behavior. In effect, the harm principle as a negative principle means that paternalism, the offense principle, and legal moralism are not legit reasons to restrict behavior. Well, let's talk about Mill's arguments against paternalism, offense principle, and legal moralism. Mill embraces this harm principle as a negative principle, so he thinks he has good arguments for why laws based on the offense principle, legal moralism, and paternalism are not going to create the most happiness. As a good utilitarian, he thinks only laws based on the harm principle will prevent more unhappiness than they create. Well, is he right about that? Let's see. Okay, so Mill is very famous as a utilitarian philosopher. Mill is one of the main supporters of utilitarian philosophy. The only other person as famous for formulating utilitarianism and defending it might be this guy Jeremy Bentham. So Mill argues for the harm principle, the negative harm principle, on purely utilitarian grounds. He's going to say that putting any kind of restriction on people's behavior when that behavior doesn't harm others is going to do more harm than good. It's going to create more unhappiness or prevent more happiness than it prevents unhappiness. If you restrict people's behavior, yeah, you might prevent some unhappiness, but you are going to cause more unhappiness, more pain. You are going to likely prevent some pleasure as well. So the only good reason to restrict behavior is, if it harms others. Easy to see how behavior that harms others creates a lot more unhappiness than happiness it might create, right? Think back to the murder example. If someone murders somebody, well, that behavior, it might make the murderer unhappy, but it's going to create this ripple effect, all this unhappiness throughout society, going to create more unhappiness for society at large than it might create happiness for the murderer, right? Same goes with assault. Somebody breaks another person's nose, punches them in the face. It might make the person who punches that person happy, but it's going to cause a lot of pain to the person who gets punched. That pain is going to outweigh whatever happiness that the person who throws the punch gets, right? What's more, if we allow somebody to go out in society throwing punches, well, he's probably going to create a lot of unhappiness out there. So very good utilitarian reasons, Mill thinks, for restricting behavior that harms others, but when the behavior doesn't harm others, well, there aren't any good utilitarian reasons. In fact, utilitarian reasons will say we shouldn't restrict the behavior. So let's look at Mill's arguments against the offense principle and the principle of legal moralism and paternalism. He'll give utilitarian reasons for thinking these are bad reasons to restrict behavior. So I think we can lump Mill's utilitarian arguments against the offense principle and the principle of legal moralism together. So let's look at Mill's argument. Mill says restrictions on behavior will make people whose behavior is restricted really unhappy. If the state tells you not to do something you want to do, you are not going to like that. It's probably going to frustrate you. Even if it doesn't frustrate you, if you want to do it, you think it will make you happy. Not being able to do it will deprive you of the happiness that doing it would bring, right? All right. In the case of offense, well, we'll only spare the public a little unhappiness, and in the case of legal moralism, won't spare the public any real unhappiness. You know, think about breastfeeding, right? Even people who are offended by it, it's not that much pain that it causes them. It's over pretty quickly. Mothers who aren't allowed to breastfeed, that causes them a lot of frustration, a lot of unhappiness. Even if you add up all the unhappiness that's prevented by all these people not being offended, almost certainly it causes the mother in question more unhappiness not to do it than the unhappiness saved by people who would be offended by it who aren't now offended by it, right? So offense principle, very likely to cause the person whose behavior restricted more unhappiness than it prevents in the people who would be offended by the behavior. Legal moralism, this is even clearer, right? Public doesn't even see it. It doesn't harm the people who are doing it. Laws based on legal moralism, as far as I can tell, they don't prevent any real unhappiness, but they cause unhappiness because people can't do what they want to do. So laws based on offense principle or legal moralism, likely Mill would say they're almost certain to create more unhappiness than they prevent, so they are bad laws on utilitarian grounds. Is this a good argument or not? I think it probably is, right? I think definitely Mill's given us a good utilitarian argument against legal moralism. On utilitarian grounds, it seems pretty open and shut to me. I think it's also a pretty good utilitarian argument against the offense principle, right? How much does it really hurt you to be offended? Not that much, right? And if being offended hurts you a whole lot, well, you're likely doing it to yourself. You're chewing over the offense over and over. You don't have to do that. Well, restrictions on people who want to do the thing you might be offended by or someone else might be offended by, it probably hurts them a whole lot. And if they can't do it, there's no way they can avoid being hurt by it, right? The woman who can't breastfeed in public, she can't avoid being hurt by it. You, even if you're really upset by it, you could just stop thinking about it, stop turning it over in your mind, right? The interracial couple who are in love, even if their society is really, really racist, it is going to do them more harm that they can't be seen in public together than it will all the bigots in the society that they're offended by it, right? So I think Mill is right on utilitarian grounds. The offense principle and the principle of legal moralism are really bad reasons for any restrictions on behavior. Laws based on the offense principle or legal moralism are going to create more pain or prevent more happiness than it's worth. Even if in the case of offense they prevent a little bit of unhappiness, well, they're going to cause more unhappiness to the people whose behavior is restricted, or prevent more happiness for them. So offense principle, legal moralism, bad bets, laws like that are not going to create the greatest overall happiness. So on utilitarian grounds, they're not good laws. Okay, Mill also thinks that paternalistic laws are not good laws on utilitarian grounds. So why does Mill think that? Well, Mill thinks that each individual person knows what's best for him or her. You know what's good for you. You know what's good for you in a way that the person making the law, be it a legislator or whoever, you might think of Mayor Bloomberg in New York making these laws, putting restrictions on sugary soda. You know what's good for you better than Mike Bloomberg does. So Mill will say, well, because you know what's good for you better than the lawmakers or the bureaucrats, they're only going to create unhappiness by getting in your way because they don't know what's good for you and you do. They might think they know what's good for you, they don't. You know what's good for you, they don't. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Let's look at the individual steps in Mill's argument. Each individual knows what's best for him or her. So letting each individual do what he or she wants will create the most happiness for him or her. Preventing them from doing what they want will prevent some happiness and maybe even create unhappiness. I know what's good for me. Think about the New York laws against sugar, right? Mayor Bloomberg says, well, you might very well want the huge big gulp. Hopefully you guys heard about Mayor Bloomberg's war on sugar. You couldn't buy the giant 40-ounce big gulps because he said, nobody should really want to do all that sugar. It's really bad for you, right? So you might think that I don't want to do all that sugar because it's going to hurt me in the long run. It might cause diabetes, might cause me to get overweight. But I'm a better judge what I think is going to bring me happiness. If I want to drink 40 ounces of soda, I think it'll make me happy, and I'm a better judge of that than you are. If I want to smoke, then I think it'll make me happy. I'm a better judge of what will or won't make me happy than is the government. If I think smoking will make me happy and the government doesn't, well, I am much more likely to be right about that than the government, or so says Mill. So paternalistic laws will prevent people from doing what they want. If people are the best judges of what will make them happy, well, preventing them from doing what they want will at the very least prevent them from getting the happiness that they would get from doing what they want. It will probably even create some unhappiness because they're going to be frustrated that they can't do what they want. So paternalistic laws will prevent some happiness and likely even create some unhappiness, so paternalistic laws are wrong on utilitarian grounds. Well, is this a good argument? I don't think it actually is. Look, I think we can put a lot of pressure on both premise 1 and 2. And premise 4 depends on 1 and 2. If 1 and 2 aren't good premises, the argument doesn't work. So each individual knows what's best for him. Is that really always true? I'm not so sure it is. I have an uncle who smokes, and he says, all that stuff about smoking being bad for you, that's just a government conspiracy. They just, for some reason, they don't want us to smoke. Never really makes sense why the government would have a conspiracy about that. And he'll say, smoking's not bad for you. Smoking doesn't really harm you at all. Well, I don't think he knows what's best for him, right? I mean, smoking is bad for you. If my uncle is puffing away on his cigarettes, saying, well, that's not bad for me, he's just wrong about that. He's wrong about that, and the government bureaucrats, the legislators who say, yes, smoking is bad for you, they are right. If my uncle doesn't think smoking is bad for him, and he smokes, well, he probably doesn't know what's best for him. And there are a lot of cases where a lot of us might not know what's best for us, right? I mean, think about Mill's argument here, right? He would, if we really took it seriously, we would have to say that each of us can, if we want to, treat our own illnesses. Well, we're often wrong about the best way to treat our illnesses. I don't want to pick on my relatives, but my Aunt Audrey, when she gets a cold, she wants to take antibiotics. That's not good for her, right? Antibiotics don't treat a cold. A cold's a virus. If she takes antibiotics, all she's going to do is maybe make it more likely that she will get back, infections that are antibiotic resistant. It would be bad for her if she did what she wants. She does not know what's best for her. The doctor knows what's best for her in a way she doesn't. The people who make laws saying that you need a prescription to get antibiotics, they know what's best for her in a way that she doesn't. So is Mill right that each individual knows what's best for him or her? No. It's really easy to come up with counterexamples to that claim. Well, even if we accept one, and I don't think we should, is it always the case that you do what's best for you just because you know what's best for you? No, of course not, right? I beg my wife not to bring sugary stuff into the house. I don't want her to bring cupcakes in. I don't want her to bring cookies in, because I will eat them. I know they're bad for me. I know what's good for me. It's not a breakfast of cupcakes. Well, I know what's good for me, but am I necessarily going to do what's good for me? I suffer from weakness of the will. Lots of people do as well. Lots of smokers know that smoking is bad for them, and they still smoke, right? So I think you could say to Mill, well, even if we know what's best for us, we often don't do it. And if we don't do it, will preventing us from doing it, well, might that not create the most happiness? If you somehow outlawed sugary snacks for me, well, it might actually create the most happiness for me in the long term, because I seem to be pretty bad at self-control when they're around. Well, but it would really help me lose weight if they're not around. So might that not be what's best for me in the long term? Same with smoking. A lot of smokers might be weak-willed. Some smokers might even thank us if it's harder for them to smoke. That might make it easier for them to quit. Is it really the case that all paternalistic laws are wrong on utilitarian grounds? Will all paternalistic laws create more unhappiness than they prevent? I don't think that that's true. And if that's true, then Mill's argument, his utilitarian argument, that the harm principle is the only good reason to restrict behavior fails. There might be perfectly good paternalistic grounds to restrict behavior that a utilitarian should accept. And if there are, well, Mill's argument doesn't accomplish what he thinks it does. Now look, I think often paternalistic laws are going to create more unhappiness than they prevent. I think we should be suspicious of paternalistic laws. But being suspicious of them is much different from saying, well, they're always bad, they're always wrong. That I wouldn't say. I don't think you can get an argument that paternalistic laws are always wrong on utilitarian grounds So Mill's argument doesn't work. Well, does that show that there are no good arguments against paternalistic laws? I don't think so. I think Mill is wrong to think that utilitarianism gives us a good argument against all paternalistic laws. Kantianism might do better. And I think Kantianism gives us a pretty direct and simple argument against paternalistic laws. Paternalistic laws fail to respect individuals' ability to make choices. Think about what we're doing with a paternalistic law. We're saying, oh, you've chosen to smoke or you've chosen to drink the 40-ounce big gulp. You're wrong, so we're not going to let you do it. Well, that seems the definition of not respecting someone's choice. And remember, Kantianism will say we should respect other people's choices as long as they don't harm others. And we should respect other people's choices even if we don't agree with them. If they harm others, if the choices they make use another person as a mere means, well, that's a good reason to put a restriction on that behavior. People shouldn't be used as mere means. By restricting that behavior, we're preventing it. But the Kantian will say, if we restrict behavior that doesn't harm others, we're using the person whose behavior we restrict as a mere means. We're using him or her as a mere means to their own happiness. Now that might sound weird, but for a Kantian it makes sense. Using someone as a mere means to his or her own happiness, well, that might be using him or her as a mere means to a good end, but remember, Kantianism says you can't use people as a mere means even to a good end. So paternalistic laws are wrong because they fail the formula of humanity. We don't respect people's choices, even though those choices don't harm others. Well, if we don't respect people's choices and we force them to do stuff contrary to their choices or prevent them from making their choices, we are using them as mere means. That's wrong according to the formula of humanity, so paternalistic laws are wrong because they fail the formula of humanity. Now, next lecture, I'll put some pressure on this Kantian argument against paternalistic laws, but I think it's a lot better than the utilitarian argument, even though Mill thinks there is a good utilitarian argument against paternalism. Okay, so let's assume that we can establish the negative harm principle, that it's the only good reason to put restrictions on behavior. Utilitarianism can't do it, but I think Kantianism might be able to. Well, two questions I think we ought to ask. Can we restrict behavior only if it actually harms someone, behavior like punching another person in the nose or damaging their property, or can we restrict behavior that's likely to? Drugs are a good example of this. Simply by doing drugs, even a hard drug like methamphetamine or heroin, I don't directly harm anyone else. It just becomes a lot more likely that I'm going to harm somebody else. Well, can you restrict that behavior even though it doesn't directly harm anyone because it's likely to? Or can you only restrict behavior that directly harms someone? This will be a big issue when we talk about what Mill says about drugs and when we talk about what Boas says about drugs. The final one, what counts as a harm? Well, the huge issue here, there are a lot of issues, but the big one for our purposes is that a lot of times if we do something that hurts us, doesn't it also hurt others? If I do heroin and I overdose and I end up in the hospital, well, isn't that going to harm my wife and my family as well? It's going to make her and my parents really unhappy. I'm not, by the way, doing heroin. Don't picture me with needles and baggies and everything around my computer. I just think it's a nice, memorable example, right? I have absolutely no desire to do heroin. But if I did do heroin and I did overdose on it, yeah, it would harm me. But might you also not say by harming myself, I'm harming others? Well, if that's true, then is the line between the harm principle and paternalism really as clear as we might think it is? That will be a really important question when we get to Boaz and his arguments against drug laws.